Even though I retired in 1964, I retired, hung the guitar up until 3 years ago when I got talked into coming back playing again. And I was very... I was seriously very concerned about whether what I was doing was around anymore or whether the younger generation would accept it. So I says, let me go out and try something at a college first or a high school and see just what the reaction is. If they boo me away, I says, then I'll just go right back into hiding. And if they like me, why, I'll go play some more. Automobile accident, the doctor said, Les, everything you got is broken. I said, what about the arm? And he said, well, that'll have to be fixed in one position. I said, well, aim it toward my navel and I'll be able to play the guitar. Anybody that has a question they'd like to ask me for the next few minutes, I'd be glad to answer them for you.
Consider yourself an inventor or a performer, and what's the line between?
I don't believe that there is a line between them because my mother had a player piano, and the first multiple I made was punching holes in her piano roll. And when they were bad, I just cover them over with a Band-Aid. Then I heard a guitar, and I immediately saved up my money, and I got a guitar. Where the hell you been? You just coming in now? Geez, we've been here for hours. Oh, you went out to turn on. Well, then it wasn't loud enough when I sang and played out in the open and in concert halls, which were usually band concerts outside. So what I did is I stole my mother and father's radio. He had one down at the store, and I took them and used them as PA systems. And I made my own microphone, which I have home, and then I jabbed the pickup needle into the top of the guitar and turned it on. Instead of playing a record, I played my guitar. And it picked up the sound of the guitar, and from there on became the electric guitar. But it wasn't a true reproduction of the instrument, and so I decided that it was time to make a recording device that would give me a true reproduction of what I actually heard with my ear. That led me into electronics very heavily, And the inventions came, all were necessities that I had a craving for, that I heard in my mind, but I couldn't go to anybody and talk about it, because how do you talk about something in your head?
I prefer the control that he brought to recording. Up until he really started experimenting with recording techniques, the only way you could record was with several mics live onto 2 tracks of tape, and the entire session had to be balanced accordingly. If horns were used and they were louder than the bass player, for instance, well, that meant you put the horns farther away from the mic than the bass player. And after the record was done, if that balance wasn't quite right, there was nothing at all that could be done to alter it, except very, very, minutely. Les Paul came into the picture and said, there doesn't have to be 2 tracks only and recorded all at once. We can have 8 tracks right now and record them whenever we want. You can record 1 track, and then you can listen to that and record something else. And he was one person that brought all the close miking techniques that we have today, all the ideas about recording things and cell syncing one at a time, overdubbing, changing. He brought the whole balancing situation after we've recorded. All those things were made possible by Les Paul.
And they make 2 copies on wax. One is the master, and one of them is the playback, and it's ruined. And Bing says, sounds fine to me. And he says, Les, what do you think? And I said, I don't like it. And so Bing says, it's good, pass it. And we're in the car, and Bing says, what's wrong with that record? And I says, oh, it's technical, Bing. I says, but there's a lot of things that I desire that are not there. He says, you ought to build your own studio. And so we drove down Hollywood, Sunset Boulevard, looking for a place to build a studio. And I says, Bing, hold it. I don't want to build a studio. I said, I just want to play the guitar. I'm not interested in recording studios and being tied down. But when I got home, my buddies asked me how did it go with Bing, and I told them it was okay. And Bing had mentioned that I ought to build my own studio. And one of my friends says to me, well, why don't you do it? And I says, well, I don't have it. He says, you can do it right here in the garage. You wheel the cad out. I had an old clunker cad. He says, you pull the cad out. He says, we board it up. We didn't know anything about permits. We didn't know about fire hazards or nothing. I remember for the first year, we used to go through the window to get into the studio. We didn't even have a door for it. I get the MGM people, and a violinist would look and he'd say, I'm not going to step through no window and go in that cracker box. I just come from MGM with the finest studio in the world. They'd say, well, wait till you hear what Les has got here. When you bought the microphone years ago, it said that you should never be any closer than a yard from the microphone. So everybody abided by the rules. Well, I didn't know about the rules, and I could care less, and moved him right in close. And I found this tremendous sound that came out by putting your mouth right up to the microphone. This is the 8. Then the idea came about to conceive a 16-track, which was nothing more than an extension of the 8-track. And so by developing that technique, I can remember when all Hollywood was in my backyard because of this new sound, and that's what they called it. I remember Capitol Records, we called a meeting, and they said, what are we going to call this sound you have with the multiple tracks and the echo and the phase shifting and so forth and so on? What are we going to call this close miking technique and so forth and so on, direct to disc and so forth and so on? I said, why don't we call it the new sound? I met Mary in 1945, and we got married in 1949. Mary used to sing hillbilly songs. I went to Capitol Records and says, will you change the contract and make this Les Paul and Mary Ford?